So the book here, taken at the flood, a memoir of a political life by Vasanth Kannabiran, who of course needs actually, literally, no introduction, and she is in her home turf, on her home turf. So I'm not going to say who Vasanth is. I'm going to speak about the book. So I was trying very hard to figure out how I would describe the book, and I actually find it very hard to come up with a single word to describe the book. And so this book can be read and will be read by different people and received by different people in multiple ways. I find this an extremely important book. At the same time, I find it a delightful book. And I think when you read it, you'll know why. You can actually say both in the same breath. For me, this book is special, and I'll just tell you why. Vasanth and I are separated by age, I think, by around 25 years. But we are part of the women's movements in India, the feminist movement, as well as the human rights movement. And this book is, it actually tracks from almost the early 80s, or perhaps a little before that also, Vasanth? You're a little before that also, about the political charting and tracking the milestones of the political life, particularly in Andhra, but not confined to undivided Andhra, and what was happening in the women's rights movement. And so for me, this book is also to understand the history from where many of us come. And if someone like me is sitting here and sharing with all of you and speaking with all of you, I would unhesitatingly say that it is because there have been before us many in the feminist movement, in the human rights movement, who've made the way for all of us to be able to take it a little further. And it's a book where if you want to understand the political history of those times, you could actually find it in this book. So there are, and at the same time, it is a personal journey. It sees all the events, all of life, the experiences, and her insights. So it's not a history book. It's her story, literally. And it's how she has received what was happening and how she thought about it. So it's an interesting way of also looking at history, and not in the cliched personalist political form, but actually the events of that time. For instance, if I was to look at what have been her engagements, and a large part of the book is also about her journey with K.G. Kannabiran, her husband, partner, and of course, perhaps the foremost human rights lawyer, not again just in Andhra Pradesh, but in the country, and someone whose understanding and insight of the nature of the state, the events that were happening, all of us have learned a great deal from. The journey that they did together, she talks about that from her experiences, and the relationship, and what is a relationship between, in a couple where both persons are politically engaged and politically active and are extraordinary. And while there is a place where I'll read out where she says, she presents herself as maybe the world sees her as a harmless creature. Vasanth, after this book, nobody is ever going to see you as a harmless creature. So that phase is definitely over. And how did the two of them engage with each other personally? And I think that's interesting. I don't know if Paromita is here, and she was talking about relationships, and I think there's an interesting way in which one looks at relationship between two people who are also very politically engaged and involved, both in their own spaces as well as together. So we're talking of someone who was active at the time, to frame it in the women's rights movement context from Mathura to Nirbhaya, to give a very broad time frame of 2 milestones, but also from the time of, say, the Beijing declaration and meeting, and now the Beijing plus 25. So it's really a span of where she takes you through the growth of ideas, how those ideas came about through her own work, through her own writing, through the different organizations she's been either part of or set up, or associations, whether it is Stree Shakti Sangathan or later Asmita. And I'll come to that, where she describes that perhaps setting up of Asmita, and there's a very funny phrase that she uses, and I wonder what that would look like. She says maybe this karma of setting up Asmita will bring her the feminist heaven. And I've been wondering since then what a feminist heaven would look like, and maybe Vasanth will tell us what in her imagination that feminist heaven would be. She talks about what were the growth of the political ideas, and there's a certain frankness, not only about the political engagements, but also the relationships. And she's talking about real people, her contemporaries. And she's frank and honest about how those relationships are. I'll read a little bit from that. But also very honest about herself, and how she was, how she understood them, perhaps not immediately, what she thought of them in retrospect. For instance, in the earlier session that we were, it was brought up that, there was a time when it was not considered good that Mills and Boons should be read by girls. Well, in her book, she tells us she had read almost all of George Bernard Shaw at the age of 10. So you deal with that. You forget Mills and Boon. So it's something that all of us are wondering how anybody could have done, but she did. At the same time, I think, particularly for the women's movement and the feminist movement, why, and there have been other memoirs, what is special and important about this is what we now call in UN jargon intersectionality. Well, without the intersectional framework, it's a life that was lived with engagement both with the left movement, with the politics of the left, with the Naxal movement, as well as with the feminist movement. And almost you see her going in and out of both, and the democratic rights movement, the civil liberties movement, not just with Kanna and his work, but with her own engagement and bringing into it both a criticism, which of course we have all in the movement benefited from, because the kind of issues that had to be raised with the left, where the issue of gender, for instance, or women's rights was eclipsed, or work that women do was eclipsed, and there was a different form in which politics and work had to be done, or revolution had to be envisaged, and how their engagement of women like Vasanth at a direct level, not just in her writings, but in her day-to-day engagement with all those people in Andhra Pradesh, changed the way women were perceived as being part of these movements, where ideas were perceived, often with resistance, and of course, the debate and engagement, it continues, it's not over, but there was an important beginning, I would say, that was made through interventions of feminists such as Vasanth, and she discusses that in her book. So the conjunction between left, feminism, and civil liberties is actually the terrain that the book goes through, but through an extremely personal journey, where she talks about just a meeting and her observation, and what happened at that meeting, and who came home, and who ate the food, and how food and looking after people and caring for people and making relationships and not just having a political conversation. So it's a very different book. I mean, I would imagine a very different activist would write it very differently. For instance, she'll talk about the Bhargav Commission, the Tarkunde Committee, the Concerned Citizens Committee, which for many of us in the human rights movement is one of the pinnacles of trying to understand how to engage with the state, particularly on the vexed issue of violence, which even today we don't seem to have a way either to, the correct vocabulary and the manner in which those arguments are to be made. She talks about them, and why I would say it's very important for different generations to read this book. She's not going to give you 20 pages of what was the terms of reference, what were the issues, what had to be done. Actually, all that is available in the public domain. She gives you a fleeting personal glance and glimpse at it. And once you've had that glance, your curiosity would be aroused and intrigued, and you would go and find out much, much more about what were these commissions really doing and how she was. Vasanth, the other thing I find very fascinating in the way you have written this, she's almost a witness and a participant. And there are times when she's speaking that this is what she's looking at, and she's actually part of that also. And I find that very interesting how she's able to step back also and write about it and be very much part of the whole process, because it's not as though she was just standing on the outside, but she was actually influencing and engaging with the activism, with the debates, with the discussions. To get down to more specifics, which I want to point out from here. And I don't know if how many of you are there, but we have a nationwide loose association called the National Association of Women's Organization, which I think you've seen the birth of, and you described that. And actually, there are little things here which I read, which I didn't know at all. And therefore, for me, it was like, oh, this is how this thing started. You hear about these. They become part of what you know, but you've never known the history or what triggered it off, what led somebody to come together and create another organization, association, affiliation. What I also find interesting is how you are able to go into adult education, teach English in the university, in the college for a long period, go into adult education, go into women's rights, translations, and chronicling the history of that period and women's history in particular, and yet exit without having gained some insights, learnings, but move on to a new, a very different sometimes new way of working without necessarily carrying baggage, and being able to just shrug it off and move ahead with it. And it's really, you almost feel that, this person has lived multiple lives with the kind of movements, organizations, initiatives that she's been part of. I'll just read out a couple of things, because there was something about humor, for instance, that was also being discussed. You would think that somebody who's in the women's rights movement, who's in the human rights movement, talking about extrajudicial killings and this stuff is not going to be. Well, there are two things about her writing style that I found very endearing. One was, when you least expect it, there will be there'll be something really funny which will be thrown in just when you're reading and you're thinking, she's not giving you any somber lessons of life. She's just talking about her life. She's not asking anyone, learn from my life, do what I did the right thing. None of that in the tone and tonality of the book. And the other thing she does is, which I think particularly as a lawyer I admire very much, is the precision with which she's able to communicate in such few words. The sentence will be a very short sentence, but she's actually said everything. If she wants to talk about, the family that she came from, because she starts from her childhood, and how early on in her childhood she started getting a sense of what is caste. She's not going to hold forth, and she can. She's written other books, and she can hold forth on caste. But she's not going to do it. She'll just say it in one sentence and actually tells you everything without having to do an entire essay on caste, human interaction, friendship, sharing and eating food and clothes. And I found that very, very interesting. But let me first just read out a couple of pages where so she's talking about, I mentioned to you, the feminist heaven. Let me just read that out from page 59. So this is about setting up Asmita, a women's rights organization, in 1991, of which her daughter Kalpana Kannabiran, again, a very well-known sociologist, as well as somebody who studied law and is a legal scholar, but very well known in her own right, is part of Asmita. She writes here, we deliberately brought together a group of women who were friends, but not as tightly bound together as the Stree Shakti group, referring to the earlier organization she was part of, the Stree Shakti Sangathan, so that new entrants would not feel left out or excluded. In practice, we discovered later that such an approach doesn't necessarily work. In the end, no, this is not the part on, oh, so I'll come to this part later. Sorry, I'm really disorganized. The part on Asmita and feminist heaven is down here. Out of Asmita and its networks have emerged many leaders who set up new organizations and trod new paths. This is a matter of personal pride and achievement. My ticket tour, and in bracket, God forbid, feminist heaven. So I will ask you to tell us a little bit more about the feminist heaven, because the only problem with this, with the precision with which she writes, is that sometimes you just want to know a little bit more, but it's not there. So it's either left to your imagination to figure out what the feminist heaven would look like. In another place, she talks about her trip to Pakistan, where they were at some point served vegetarian food. I mean, that's really almost blasphemous, I agree. And she talks about the horror upon horror, where after the vegetarian meal, they were asked to visit a temple in Pakistan, and she describes that as horror upon horror. And the book is being written now, so, you know, we can still want to write certain things. She also talks about many very prominent leaders, particularly from the left and the Maoist movement. And those people would be considered, you know, like the Dada Logs, who you learn from and only learn from. But Vasanth, in one, when you read the book, you'll know she names them. She knows each one of them at a personal basis. She actually talks about how she hopes she has cured one of them a wee bit. And I think, Vasanth, through your engagements and the feminist movement in Andhra Pradesh in particular, I think you cured many in the left more than a wee bit, and all of us stood to gain from it. And it's an ongoing engagement between the left and feminism. They are not watertight, excluded compartments at all, but I think there are some inherent tensions which are necessary. The tension is not something that I think we should avoid or not have. I think it's an inherent tension, and it should be there. There are also some, and when she talks, it's a very, I mean, it makes you, she makes her life seem like, as she says, she describes herself. I must read out to you that harmless creature that she describes herself as. But it's also described as though, you know, this is casual. And actually, the events that she's referring to, whether it is the first meeting that the Maoists are holding in public in Andhra Pradesh, where she goes and Kanna is there, and they're both participating, and she's witnessing and understanding what is happening and trying to see how people are reacting to it. And that's helping her develop her own understanding about what this movement is and what it means to the people out there. So they are actually extremely significant milestones in the building of our democracy, not just confined to Andhra Pradesh. But the manner in which it's written is as though it's not, that's why I'm saying it's not about, I have understood this and this is what you need to understand from this. It's an effortless way of saying this is how I think about it and I'm sharing it with you. And these are, so if you look at page 47, where Vasanth is talking about, and equally critical of the women's movement, equally critical of women's groups. And I must say there was a place where I had to pause and think, because I've always believed that particularly autonomous, non-funded movements do better when there are strong bonds of friendship and trust. But somewhere you are also, and in women's groups, that's a very, that's a big high voltage high that happens. And what you are telling us is that sometimes maybe that's too overwhelming and doesn't necessarily empower and may also disempower, which I must say I was compelled to revisit, and not something that I would have my thoughts were that you need to have a lot of trust and friendship to take these political campaigns forward. But Vasanth writes, the sense of failure, she's talking about moving from one, a group which has been together, the Stree Shakti Sangathan, and friendships which are very intense. And then over time, there are other, there is some amount of moving away, some amount of friction that develops. And she says, the sense of failure at losing that comradeship, friendship, loyalty, which haunted me then, was probably similar to what many women who came to us for help feel about their broken marriages. A feeling of guilt, inadequacy, perhaps even shame. And this has happened with groups across the country. The one problem that is most common to most women's groups is a tendency to police each other. Also, the passionate attachments that develop between us are often good, but mostly disastrous. I think these are also conversations that we've not very often had. We haven't put out in the public domain. These have been very in-house conversations. And through her own life experiences, you've actually put them out, that these are as much part of the political conversation that we should have as are the other issues, not just about the political issues or perhaps issues of funding, but also how we relate and engage with each other. And at another place, she talks about how we should see whether these relationships are empowering or do they at some point become disempowering. And it's not as though she's laying the blame on the other women in the group. She's very much carrying the blame as herself being part of it. The other thing that I want to just point out is, when you read the book, the other thing that strikes you is that, yes, there has been, in many, many ways, there's been a shift in the political understanding of issues of civil liberties, etc., of women's rights, which today are, you have departments that were there in universities. Now we are, of course, turning the clock around and shutting them down rapidly. But some ideas have become foundational ideas. And at the same time, you get a feeling of being in a spiral or in a loop. And you talk a lot about the extrajudicial killings in Andhra Pradesh, because that, particularly in your house with Kanna, not only were people coming to him for legal interventions, but were also coming to him because they were activists who were being hounded, who were being killed. And the people who were being killed, whether it was Gadar being shot in the chest or it was Dr. Ramanathan being shot, these were not people out there for you. They were people you both knew very closely, and they've been part of your lives and your homes. And and again, this is my lawyer bias. The judgment of the Andhra Pradesh High Court on extrajudicial killings, where people like Kannabiran and all had argued, is even today perhaps the most important jurisprudence on extrajudicial killing. And while you talk about that, or you talk about how egregiously the imprisonment of Binayak Sen affected Kanna and his well-being, we find ourselves, I'm just handing it over, please. We find ourselves again in the same loop of talking about encounters. Binayak is out on a suspended sentence, but we have Sudha Bharadwaj, again somebody who both of you know and Kanna knew in jail. So somewhere we are seeing this cycle as we're not able to get out of that loop, and they seem to be hounding us again and again. I'm going to hand it to her because time has clearly flown while we were talking.
Frankly, after I listened to Vrinda, I'm just wondering, did I really write all that? Did I really do all that? Like this, I forget her name, Pajama or whatever. Avunu kabolu. Avunu kabolu analanpistundi. But I have led, and I realize now, I mean, I felt I had to put it down somewhere, not because I have low self-esteem in many ways. I sound loud and brash, but my self-esteem is low. But I felt that I had to put down these things. And now when I sit, I decided, I had written all this. And looking at Paramita, I realized what I've done in the book is a kind of a striptease, which is why Vrinda is not quite, saying, why haven't you said more about this or more about that? It would run to 5 volumes if I had. But it was no small thing to have been a child during the Razakar regime and the riots, to have lived through that, to have had to migrate, to come back, to live through the emergency. And closely, I mean, it was our good ill fortune, I don't know, but whatever, that Kannabiran was so involved in the emergency, so it became so central, to our lives. How we got through, there is no extraordinary courage that I can think of, or no extraordinary bravery. One just went chugging on with life. Dealing with every issue as it came. There wasn't even time to grieve a lot with most of our friends in jail, people going into jail. Every day getting reports of this. It was business as usual almost. One couldn't allow oneself to feel. We just had to deal with these things. But I was also extremely rich in my life. As a child, I knew Harinna Chattopadhyaya, Magdu Moinuddin, because my uncle was in the Communist Party. He was founding member. Then 2 granduncles were founding members of the Communist Party. So all these people, whether it was Magdum, whether it was Harinna Chattopadhyaya, whether it was Lito Ghosh, so many people came in and out of our house at that time when I was a child. Then as I grew on, there has been I was thinking about it, practically no political personality who has not stepped into our house. So we had everybody. We had Ravi Narayan Reddy sending notes and coming in. We had Namboodiripad coming in. Then we had Chandrapula Reddy sending a note and calling Kanna because he was underground the moment to come and meet him. We had Kondapalli Sitaramaya come. There was nobody who did not call Lavenka. Who do I mention? Who do I not mention? And my own feeling when I look at this is a sense of how much I've left out. But if I'd had to write about all the people that I remember now, and if I had to mention them, that would have had to run into some 30 volumes. There were so many close friends who worked so closely, who were so important. Like Umar sitting here, Naren, I don't think he figures in the book, but Naren was such a close friend who asked me to lead a march of agricultural workers from Chandrababu Naidu's village. He asked me, a woman, to lead that march against taxes and whatever, land thing. But I am so grateful to all these people who enrich my life. In so many ways, my life has been enriched. In so many ways. Now when I think back, I think, how did we live through this? If you read the book, you will see all these accounts of people, attacks, guns being pointed at the house, and so on. But we lived with it. it was life as usual. Living with the fear that your children will be picked up. My children were told never to go out of school with anybody except my brother and one friend, Jaypal. If somebody came and told them that father or mother were ill and in a hospital, that never were they to leave. Just stay in school, stay put. And then my grandchildren later, which became painful, and we said no. But the richness of this life, I mean, after I've written it, it was also terrible writing it, in the sense I wrote a large amount, then huge chunks have been cut out, I cut out a lot, and then now it has reached this form. So when yesterday Vrinda said that she was delighted with my style, I almost fainted. I have taught English for so many years. I mean, that was my living. For 25 years, I taught English literature to undergraduate students. And I learned a lot from my teaching. I learned some from my teachers, but a lot from teaching my students from my teachers. And my Telugu medium students from my teachers, not the English medium students, not the convent educated students. It was the Telugu medium students who forced me to interpret stuff for them so that they would be able to, catch the nuances of Shakespeare or Milton. So I have learned from so many people. And I was so rich in people. Kaloji Narayan Rao was constantly in my house. Keshav Jadhav, M.T. Khan, Shankaran. My life is so empty without these people. We never had a week pass without these people there. And one by one, they have all gone. One by one, all of them have gone. And I can't tell you how empty that feels. And Vrinda talked about a feminist heaven. And I said, God forbid a feminist heaven. If you've been in strictly feminist meetings and been through those arguments, you know what it'll be. A feminist heaven and a feminist hell is no line that divides that. You just be skinned alive. It is total terror. Every argument is too passionate. It's to the point of being lynching, and you love the other person, but you're spitting and arguing, and it's horrible. So people who have been in that kind of a group, know. And if you've been to the first Bombay conference, the women's conference, you would know what went on there. So I don't know. My life has seen so many things. After the emergency, then all that was happening, then Kanna's work, both in the APCLC and then in the PUCL. This whole thing of this the Delhi dominance, where PUCL people felt only Delhi people were, qualified. Delhi judges could be presidents of PUCL and not some lawyer who was in Hyderabad. And Kanna refused. He was elected, but he refused to move to Delhi. So, but with that, what happened was the nature of PUCL got radical completely, and it became a nationwide organization, not something confined to Delhi and a few liberals who went around and did the bit of fact-finding or whatever it is. And then watching this man, living with that man was no ordinary thing. Watching him suffer, people only knew how gruff he was, how straightforward he would be, how he would... Shankaran would always say, we went and Kanna held forth, and we all listened. So if he started shooting off, then people just listened. But how sensitive he was at heart, how deeply he suffered for people, how important it was for him to work on a principle. That was no ordinary thing. And that's shaped, and that was my opportunity, like both of us. He's getting involved from 69 onwards in defense work and defense committee work, and my getting involved, helping him doing his work and so on, because it was not work that you could entrust to somebody else. With that, I grew. He grew and I grew with him. And I think I did little things about pulling him down a little bit, not letting him grow into a total... I was very afraid of him becoming a mega figure, of becoming completely idolized. I think I had my part in that. But frankly, when I think about it and I hear, I was nervous about this book coming out. I was very afraid of writing it. I didn't know what to write, what I could write, what I couldn't write. I have left out 2/3 of my life in this. But that doesn't mean I can write 2 more volumes. But it has been, I must say that at this point, I am totally humbled and totally grateful for the kind of life that I led. No one could have lived a life of such excitement, such energy, such fear. I mean, never on such a high tension basis. And that was because, Kanna led it as well. And a little bit of a prelude to this book was that when Kanna's memoirs were published in Telugu as 24 hours, Amar, Devulapalli Amar had asked Venu to record it and was published serially and then as a volume. Then when they brought out as a volume, Amar looked around and he couldn't find anybody who was fit, worthy of writing a preface to that. So they came to me and said, you write the preface. I said, why me? I'm nobody. Why do you want to call me to write this preface? What do I have to do with him? You get somebody, some big shot somewhere to write the preface. I'm not. And they said, no, we have thought about it. We have thought and racked our brains. You are the only person who is in touch with and aware of every field that he was involved in. Others were involved with particular fields, but you were involved with every field that he was in. And so I said, okay, here goes, I get a chance. So I wrote the preface to that, which was a little bit of a cheeky preface. I was not going to write a serious, solemn thing about how this man, stood up and he was great and whatever he was, and that was enough. He got enough of public adulation for that. A lot of hatred. The other thing that I didn't mention was we received so much of hate. Hate calls, hate letters. Living with that hate was very difficult. Large amount of people who distrusted you and hated you. One sees it again now when we are in the middle of, all the protests that are happening, the hate and anger that springs up the minute you take a position that they think is anti-nationalist. But we experience that hate right through Kanna's life. Letters, phone calls, silent calls. It was not an easy life to lead. And in all this life, I must say, time up? 4 minutes. Okay. But in all of this, I must say, I was not a very good mother, in the sense that I didn't bother to do the kind of things, and maybe that's what mothers should be. I didn't bother to tell my children, didn't check on whether they did their homework or not. Sometimes I would yell at them, or maybe if I got a complaint from the teacher, but otherwise I don't ever remember sitting and telling them, sit down and study. And I never sat down and studied. I was reading Shaw, and I was reading Gorky, and I was reading whatever I liked. And because I was reading, my parents, my grandparents, nobody thought of telling me, look at your school books. So I was a terrible student. I didn't know any history or any geography. I didn't know anything. But I was reading literature that was far beyond anything that any of my teachers had read. I just swallowed it. But I was probably a bad parent. But I must say that whatever that parenting was, bad or good, it seems to have worked well. I wasn't a hands-on, mother, caring. I cooked. I was a good cook, so I cooked a lot. I put a lot of good food in the house for the kids, for people who came, all of that. That's part of what I love to do. But the fact that my children have grown up well, that each of them is worthy, is respected, has found their own path, has not gone down. And I feel because children have blamed their parents for not taking responsibility for their lives, for not having worked to see that they got something. My children have never turned around and said that to me or expected anything like that from me. And they have gone ahead and they have talked in their fields. And for that, I am truly grateful. And so my book is also dedicated to my children.
Since we are anyway going to break for lunch, maybe we can take another 5 minutes if there are any questions. We have not given enough time for questions. If
there any questions, please? While people are looking for questions, because you did say striptease, so I've been encouraged to read out this line from the book, where she's talking about Kanna and herself, and she says, if I had to explain what held us together through all our troubles, I would say it was sex and humor. And the part that I mentioned earlier, where she says, in reference to someone getting surprised by how well she spoke at a public event in the US, I think, she said, I was amused. I suppose the image I present to the world is of a well-meaning and politically correct but harmless creature. As I said, please read the book, and then you'll know where harm began and where it ended.